Ever feel like background checks are uh, kind of like a necessary evil?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're important, of course,
Yeah.
but the whole process can feel like you're navigating a legal minefield
Right.
while you're trying to build trust with potential sales superstars.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we're about to make it a whole lot easier for you.
I like it.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a blog post from the Sales Experts.
Okay.
They're a recruitment firm based in London that's all about maximizing sales success.
Yeah, they know their stuff.
They've got some really insightful tips on how to make background checks not just effective,
Oh,
but also a key part of building a winning sales team.
that's great. I mean, what I find fascinating about the sales experts' approach is that they really emphasize the human element.
Yeah.
It's not just about data points and checking boxes, right?
Right.
It's about seeing candidates as individuals and building relationships with them right from the very start.
They stress the importance of transparency right off the bat. It's about being totally upfront with candidates about the whole background check process.
And that's where a lot of companies, I think, stumble.
Yeah.
They kind of think of background checks as something that happens in the background, kind of like a behind-the-scenes operation.
Yeah.
But the sales experts argue that this lack of transparency can actually damage your chances of landing top talent.
It does seem kind of counterintuitive, though, right? I think people would
That-
appreciate the discretion.
Not necessarily.
Right.
Think about it from the candidate's perspective.
Okay.
You're super excited about this new opportunity,
Yeah.
You aced the interviews, and then suddenly you're hit with this request for a background check.
Yeah.
If you haven't been prepared for it, it can feel invasive, even distrustful.
Right. It's
Yeah.
like the company is saying, we don't quite trust what you've told us.
Exactly.
Mm.
And, in a competitive market, that can be enough to send a top candidate running for the hills straight into the arms of a competitor who has a more transparent and candidate-friendly approach.
Right. So how do we avoid that?
Yeah, that's the question.
How do we make transparency a cornerstone of our background check process?
The sales experts suggest something surprisingly simple.
Okay.
Communicate,
Okay.
clearly outline the entire process to candidates right from the outset.
Uh-huh.
Let them know what types of checks you'll be conducting,
Okay.
why you're doing them,
Right.
and what information they'll need to provide.
So it's about setting expectations early on.
Yeah.
And making sure everyone is on the same page.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just verbal communication.
Yeah.
Think about providing candidates with like a clear, easy to understand document that outlines the whole process.
Kind of like a background check roadmap.
Right.
I like that.
It takes the mystery out of the equation.
Yeah.
It shows candidates that you respect their time and their privacy.
From a legal standpoint, this proactive approach probably saves you a lot of headaches, too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
In jurisdictions like the UK and the EU, data privacy regulations like the GDPR are incredibly strict.
Yeah.
Transparency is not just a best practice, it's a legal requirement.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with GDPR, can you give us a quick rundown of how it applies to background checks?
Certainly, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, places strict limitations on how companies can collect, process, and store personal data.
Uh-huh.
In the context of background checks, this means you need to be super clear about what data you're collecting,
Okay.
why you're collecting it, and how you're going to use it.
So it's not just about getting consent. It's about being transparent about the entire data lifecycle.
Exactly. You need to have a legitimate reason for collecting the data. You need to make sure it's accurate and up to date.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to have measures in place to protect it from unauthorized access or disclosure.
And it sounds like the sales experts are really big on ensuring that companies use reputable sources for their background checks.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
Because unfortunately, not all background check providers are created equal.
Oh, yeah.
There are plenty of companies out there that offer quick and cheap checks.
Mm.
But they often cut corners,
Yeah.
which can lead to inaccurate or incomplete information.
And I imagine that could have serious consequences both for the candidate and for the company.
Absolutely. Relying on unreliable data can lead to unfair hiring decisions,
Yeah.
reputational damage, and even legal liabilities.
Right.
The sales experts really hammer home the point that investing in a reputable background check provider
Mm-hmm.
is essential for ensuring data accuracy compliance with data privacy laws and ultimately making sound hiring decisions.
So we've got transparency
Uh-huh.
and reputable sources.
Yeah.
What's the next key takeaway from the sales experts when it comes to building an ethical and effective background check process?
They emphasize the importance of understanding that background checks are not a one-size-fits-all proposition. The type of checks you conduct should be tailored to the specific role and responsibilities of the position you're filling.
That makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
You wouldn't run the same checks for an entry-level sales rep as you would for a sales director overseeing multi-million-dollar contracts.
Precisely. And this is where a deep understanding of the sales landscape and the nuances of different roles comes into play.
Yeah.
The sales experts suggest a strategic approach to background checks,
Okay.
aligning the checks with the level of risk associated with the position.
So, for example, if you're hiring for a role that involves handling sensitive financial information, a credit check might be warranted.
Exactly. But for a more junior sales role, a check of employment history and references might be sufficient to verify their track record and sales success.
Mhm.
It's about finding that balance between due diligence and respecting the candidate's privacy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah,
It's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act.
for sure.
It's not just about the type of checks. It's also about being mindful of the information you're gathering,
Okay.
and how you're actually using it.
Uh-huh.
The sales experts caution against casting too wide a net.
So not just going on a fishing expedition with someone's personal data.
Exactly. It's about being very targeted in your approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
What specific information do you actually need
Uh-huh.
to assess this candidate's suitability for this particular role?
Right.
And how does that information relate to their potential for sales success?
It's about being strategic,
Yeah,
not just thorough.
precisely. And this brings us to another crucial point that the sales experts raise, which is
Okay.
the importance of context
Okay.
and open dialogue.
This is where things get really interesting
Yeah,
because it goes beyond just the data points on a report.
right. Imagine you're reviewing a background check
Okay.
and you see a gap in employment,
Uh-huh.
or maybe a discrepancy in a candidate's job title.
Okay.
It's so easy to just jump to conclusions, but the sales experts urge hiring managers to resist that urge.
So don't just assume the worst.
Exactly. Instead, reach out to the candidate.
Okay.
Express your concerns,
Uh-huh.
but in a non-judgmental way,
Right.
and give them an opportunity to explain.
Because there might be a perfectly reasonable explanation.
Absolutely. Maybe they took time off to care for a family member,
Yeah.
or maybe they started their own business that didn't quite work out.
Uh-huh.
These aren't red flags.
Right.
They're life experiences that can actually bring valuable insights and resilience to a sales team.
So it's about seeing the whole person, not just a snapshot of their past.
And that's where that open dialogue comes in.
Right.
By creating a space for honest and open communication,
Uh-huh.
you're not only demonstrating respect for the candidate,
Yeah.
you're also gathering valuable information that can help you make a more informed hiring decision.
It's about building trust and understanding right from the outset.
Exactly. And this emphasis on open dialogue also applies. If the background check reveals something more serious, like a criminal record,
This is where things can get tricky.
yeah,
How do you balance the need to protect your company
right.
with the need to give candidates a fair chance?
The sales experts acknowledge that these are difficult situations,
Yeah.
but they stress the importance of having clear policies in place
Uh-huh.
and applying them consistently.
Okay.
It's not about having like a blanket ban on hiring individuals with criminal records.
So a more nuanced approach is needed.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about taking the time to understand the circumstances of the offense,
Okay.
how long ago it occurred,
Mm-hmm.
and what the candidate has done since then to demonstrate rehabilitation.
So again, it's about seeing the individual, not just the offense.
Right. And it's about recognizing that people can change
Uh-huh.
and that everyone deserves a second chance.
Yeah.
In fact, the sales experts point out that some studies have shown
Oh, wow.
that individuals with criminal records can actually be more loyal and hardworking employees.
Because they're grateful for the opportunity and determined to prove themselves.
Exactly. So while it's crucial to conduct thorough background checks and take appropriate precautions,
Uh-huh.
it's equally important to approach these situations with empathy, fairness, and a willingness to see the potential in every candidate.
It's about recognizing that everyone has a story,
Yeah.
and that sometimes those stories, even the ones with bumps in the road, can lead to incredible sales success.
Well said. And that, I think, is the key takeaway from the sales experts' approach to background checks.
Okay.
It's not just about mitigating risk.
Mhm.
It's about seeing the human being behind the data,
Right.
building trust, and
Yeah.
creating a foundation for a successful and fulfilling working relationship.
And they offer some really practical tips on how to make that happen,
Yeah.
from creating transparent communication processes
Uh-huh.
to tailoring checks to
Sure.
specific roles
Right.
and engaging in open dialogue with candidates.
Yeah.
It's all about finding that balance
Yeah.
between due diligence and human connection.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who are eager to implement these best practices and build a winning sales team,
Yeah.
I highly encourage you to check out the Sales Experts website.
Okay.
They have a wealth of resources, including sample background check policies, templates for candidate communication, and guides on how to navigate data privacy regulations.
It's a fantastic resource for anyone involved in the hiring process,
For sure.
especially those looking to create a more human-centered and ultimately more successful approach to building a top-performing sales team.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing how the sales experts manage to turn what's often seen as a tedious hurdle into a strategic opportunity
Yeah.
for building a powerhouse sales team.
Right. I mean, they really flipped the script on background checks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of it just being a box to check,
Yeah.
it's about forging those genuine connections and making informed decisions
Right.
that ultimately lead to sales success.
And it all comes back to that human-centered approach they champion.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, let's distill the sales experts' wisdom into some actionable takeaways for our listeners.
Absolutely. First and foremost, transparency is paramount.
Okay.
Be totally upfront with candidates about the whole process.
Uh-huh.
Explain why you're even conducting checks in the first place.
Right.
And be very clear about the data you're actually collecting.
It's about building that trust from the very get-go.
Second, tailor your checks to the specific roles you're actually trying to fill.
Yeah.
That one-size-fits-all approach is not only inefficient, but can also raise some privacy concerns.
And don't forget to prioritize data, privacy, and security.
Right.
Work with reputable providers who understand the legal landscape
Yeah,
and treat candidate data with respect.
absolutely.
Finally, remember that background checks are just one piece of the puzzle.
Uh-huh.
Use them as a starting point for conversation.
Right.
Be willing to dig deeper
Yeah.
to understand the whole story.
It's about seeing the human being behind the data.
For our listeners out there who are ready to revamp their approach to background checks,
Yeah.
I think it's time for a challenge.
I love a good challenge.
Lay it on us.
Take a look at your current process.
Okay.
Ask yourself this.
Uh-huh.
Does it reflect the values of transparency, respect, and fairness that we've been talking about today? If not, it might be time for a change.
Because building a high-performing, ethical, and truly successful sales team starts with how you treat people from the very beginning.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of background checks.
It's been fun.
Huge thank you to the sales experts for providing such valuable insights.
They really know their stuff.
I think we've all learned a lot today.
To our listeners out there, keep those sales engines firing, and remember, the best sales teams are built on trust and respect.
Until next time, happy hiring.